Okay, well, we have another really interesting speaker. He's a young man with a passion for all things radio, and he is up next. Please help me welcome radio presenter, producer, and facilitator from VOW FM, Ntsikelelo Ngaleka.
How are you? I am doing okay, I'm doing great. My name is Ntsikelelo Ngaleka, and I am the host of the Science-Wise show on VOW FM, the 88.1, where you hear it, feel it, and definitely live it. And I see Mr. Kunuma smiling right here. We've been talking a lot on our show, and he promised us a trip, and he hasn't said anything about it. How are you? How is it coming along? Thank you. Thank you so much. So now, my presentation will be a day in the life of a radio presenter and a radio producer, right? And I'm going to start it with how I met radio, right? I was a student at Wits University studying a BSc in Urban and Regional Planning, which is town planning, right? The creation of settlements, the redirecting of people from informal settlements to now proper places in which they are, designated to stay in, zoning, creating spaces for, shops and whatnot. That is what I, studied at Wits University and got completed in 2021. And in my third year, which was 2021 rather, that is where I met the voice of Wits, right? And they were holding out auditions for people who wanted to be on radio, right? How many of you, maybe in the future, you want to be on radio? A show of hands. 1, 2, 3. 16, 17. But yeah, no, there's a lot of you. And this is how it happened for me. So there was auditions, and as there were auditions to VOW FM, I also submitted my audition, right? You needed to post, a video on Instagram, tagging them, doing your link. And I did that, and unfortunately, I didn't make the cut, right? I didn't make the cut, but I was not going to accept that. I was really just not going to accept that. So I went to the station about 3 days later, after they had announced the people who actually made it. And I went to the station, I asked to speak to the station manager, who at the time was Shweshwe Ku, who is now the programs manager at 702, right? And as I spoke to her, and then 2 days later, she called me, right? And the worst thing happened, right? She calls me, I'm at rest, I'm not at school, it was online school. It was back at COVID times, and not like now. And so in that time, she calls me, and it's 12 midday. She calls me to come in at 12:30. I come in at 12:30. I don't even bath. Now I'm just rushing because it's quite late. I'm just rushing. I'm like, at least I smell good. I don't smell bad. Right? So long as you're smelling good and no one can see that you didn't bath, you're fine. So I go to, the station, and she interviews me, right? As she interviews me, I get everything wrong. She asked me a question about why I wanted to be on radio, and I was like, oh, they said I have a radio voice. She was like, no, that's not how it works. And it was quite painful, because as you're sitting in, you're having this conversation with someone who's supposed to hire you, and every answer that you're giving them in an interview, they just plainly saying it to you. They're not even saying that we might call you back or anything. They're saying everything that you're saying is wrong. But, in the miracle of life, in the way things happen in life, what she did for me was that immediately after the interview, she said to me, you know what, I'm going to give you this chance. Please go shadow the team that's on air right now. And that is how I came to work at VOW FM, right? And so, to give you much more of an insight as to what I do as a radio producer, and even so as a radio presenter, so I will start with being a radio producer, right? A lot of people who want to do radio do not know that there's, on radio such things as radio production, right? what you would think, in radio is that, no, everyone who's on radio is everyone who's talking. But there's people who are behind those conversations. There's people who have ideas that they put into the show. You're listening to a show, and they're playing a fun game, and you're calling in. It's fun conversations, you're calling in. There's people who have put all that together for this person that is presenting the show. Sometimes it's the presenter themselves. They produce and present the show. And sometimes it's radio producers who are designated, who are hired specifically for that purpose. They're not going to go on air for that particular show. There might be radio presenters themselves, but in that particular show, they do not, go on air. What they do is make content for that show. So that is what I do. That is part of what I do. Ever since I joined VOW-FM, I've produced That Lunch Show, which has won awards at the South African Radio Awards. Clap your hands. Right? I have produced for Noni Kumalo in a show that was called Love Good Music. She's now at YFM. And I've worked with, quite big people in the industry. And, I've also worked with Ntsikelelo Sindane, who does Weekend Breakfast at YFM. I've produced his show, while he was still doing Monday to Fridays, 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. So I made some of the content in which he brought out on air. Although I was not particularly officially hired by YFM, I was hired by him. Because that's how you get into the industry. You make in your own connections with people who are just also getting in, they get their shows, they do not have content producers, and they're also leading, very difficult lives, and they need, as much help as they can get, and so you are there, as someone who's also trying to get by. You produce content, you do that, you do what needs to be done in order to make sure that you also take your name, add weight to your name, right? And so I produced content for That Lunch Show. I produced content then on for every other show that I've hosted. I've hosted the AM Squad, Weekend Edition. That was the first show I got on air. I hosted the AM Squad weekday versions. So from 5 a.m. through to 7 a.m. on VOW-FM, it was me being on air. I've hosted That Lunch Show, a show in which when I entered, I was the one producing it. I was the voice of lunch. I've hosted, and currently I'm hosting, The Science Was Show, which is a show that speaks directly to science and the progress that is being made within the world of science right here in South Africa. We've interviewed, Mr. Daniel, quite a number of times. I think I recall 3 conversations in which we have had, ever since last year up until now. It's also very great to meet him, to finally meet him in person, because we've always on call. But yeah, that is the gist of what I do. Now, as a radio presenter, you kind of have to be prepared for the show. And so if you are in a show where you do have content producers, you do have people who have prepared the content for you, what you do is get in early enough so that you can go through the content. And as you go through the content, you get an idea of what you're supposed to be talking about. And if you're going to have an interview, you're going to prepare your own questions. You're going to get much more of an insight. If you need to do a little more research on the topic or on whatever conversation in which we're having, that's what you do. And then you go on air, you shine, you do your link, you have the conversation. It's a fun time, people send in their engagements, people send in their WhatsApps, and people send in, their calls, they write their tweets, and it's fun. And the nice thing really about radio, for me, is how far you can take the conversation. Right? As a radio producer and someone who's also a radio presenter, I'm very proud of myself at this young age, I've had I've accumulated quite the experience in this space. And even much more now that I'm also now starting to branch out and start to do things outside of radio, it grows my name. And so it adds weight to my name. And so I'm very proud of that. But an important part of that is realizing how to take the conversation further, right? That the conversation doesn't end when I do the show and when the show ends. That's not where the conversation ends. You take the conversation further, you make people interested in what you're talking about, and you put in the time. You always, engage with different other institutions on that, and you make sure that, that conversation goes a lot further, right? But yeah, that is the gist of really what I do as a radio presenter and as a radio producer. It's Ntsikelelo Ngaleka from the Science Wise Show on VOW FM, the voice of Wits.